Hello and welcome back to another video. So today we are going to take a look at Allan Hazlett's piece on how to defeat belief in the external world. Now, if you've been feeling perhaps a little bit disoriented from the last couple of pieces we've looked at and wondering if anybody is going to be trying to provide an argument to say, hey, yeah, we're actually justified in believing the world is the way it seems to us most of the time. No, I don't have to be overly worried about whether or not the world's really the way I think it is based on scenarios in something like The Matrix or Inception. This is going to be your piece. This is going to be the one you're probably going to like the most. Now that said, Hazlett does certainly introduce some technical terminology, some various claims he makes and so on. Might be a little bit difficult to follow, hence the explanatory video. So Hazlett himself, there's a picture of him. He's an associate professor at Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. He works on epistemology, so theory of knowledge largely, as well as some other areas. So questions of value, meta-ethics, which is really sort of, when we do ethics, we're really doing moral philosophy in some sense. Meta-ethics is really philosophizing about moral philosophy, so we're taking it up a level. Moral psychology, aesthetics, so questions about art and so on. He's got two books, both of which came out in the sort of mid-2010s, I believe, both on epistemological subjects. And from my count, he's got over 40 articles today. Now, what are we going to see in this piece? Oh, again, I'm sort of cutting it off on the top. So how to defeat belief in the external world. Here again, another 21st century piece, which can be quite nice, though I think there is still value to be found in older works such as Descartes or Plato or whatnot. So what are we going to get? We're going to get Hazlett introducing some interesting terminology for us to use. So particularly the notions of defeaters, basic beliefs, and hinge propositions or hinge beliefs. So we'll have to see what those are. He takes a look at Thomas Reid's response to skepticism. So Hazlett does just sort of quickly mention a number of figures, including Reid, Wittgenstein, a whole bunch of other philosophical authors. And, feel free to look them up. I'm not going to explain who each and every person he cites is, but really what he's doing is engaging with a number of fairly well-known philosophers in this piece and taking bits and pieces from their thought and trying to do something with them. So he looks at Reid's response to skepticism, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and gives us the argument from norms and the argument from confusion. So there's a couple of different arguments he gives us, and then in the end, he provides three proposals for anti-skeptical positions. So really, ultimately, what he's going to try to do in this piece is argue that, yes, we're justified in believing that the world is the way it seems to us, and that to lose that justification, really, it's not enough just to call into question whether or not the world is the way it seems to us, given our actual situation here. But it needs to become, we need to ultimately be justified in believing that the world is not the way it seems to us, to really give up on our belief and to cease to be justified that the world really is the way it seems. So we're thinking about the kind of scenarios we get in something like Inception or The Matrix. It's really only once we have good enough reason to believe that the world really isn't the way we thought it was that we lose our justification for believing that the world is the way that it seems to be. Now, there's still sort of an open question, and I'm going to be curious to see who wants to do something with this in terms of the forums and the essays and so on. At what point in the films, say in Inception or in The Matrix, there's an interesting question there about how justified certain characters, such as in particular Neo and Cobb, are in believing that the world really is or isn't the way they thought it was anymore. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to have to shrink myself down here so everything fits nicely. So defeaters, basic beliefs, hinge propositions. So really what Hazlett is up to here is trying to defend our belief in the external world from skeptical attack, the kind of skeptical attack that we see somebody like Descartes producing in his Meditations, right? Really saying, well, look, there could be this evil demon who's out to get me. Bostrom, in some sense, might be regarded as launching a kind of skeptical attack by saying, well, look, we've got sort of equal reason to believe that we're in a computer simulation that we do, for the other two potential beliefs he outlines in the conclusion. Now, one thing to note here, and Hazlett makes this point in his footnote 4, endnote 4, when he talks about belief in the external world, he really means both that the external world exists and that it's similar to the way we normally experience it. So if you're reading through this piece and you're just sort of, thinking to yourself, what do you mean belief in the external world? Doesn't there have to be some kind of external world out there? Like, it can't all just be a figment of my imagination, can it? He means not only that there is a world out there, but that there's a world out there and that it's the way we commonly think the world is, right? That we aren't sort of mistaken on a global level about the world we live in and what it's like, that it's really the early 21st century right now, that we're really humans on planet Earth, and et cetera, in Lethbridge or Calgary or whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Hazlett believes that, or really claims that this belief in the external world is defeatable, but that we're still justified in holding it. So the first question here is, what does it mean for our belief in the external world to be defeatable? What is that? That's something that goes beyond common knowledge. That's not the kind of thing I would expect you to know if you haven't done philosophy before. Even if you've done some philosophy before, depending on what kind of philosophy you're doing, this might not be a notion you're familiar with. So what is something? What is it for something to be a defeater or to be defeatable? So Hazlett gives us a definition for a belief to be a defeater, right? Or for something to be a defeater. So he puts it this way, he says, a defeater of belief that P, and this is just a way people who work in epistemology tend to talk. So again, you've got to keep in mind that all the particular letters, right? P and S and R, these are really just variables, they're standards, right? So a defeater of the belief that P, right? We talk about, the belief that something is true, which in this case is P, any given proposition or statement, right? For S, person S, some subject, is a reason state R, right? Some reason or set of reasons, such that belief that P is or would be unjustified for S in virtue of S's possessing R. Now he goes on, he says, in many of the cases we're considering here in the piece, R is a belief or set of beliefs of S's. A reason R defeats S's belief that P, just in case S possesses R is a defeater for belief that P for S, and S in fact fails to believe P on the basis of R. That's quite the mouthful, and you might be sitting there saying, I have no better idea what that means now than when I was first looking at the piece, or even when I first encountered the word defeater. It might be that explanation he gives for you doesn't qualify as an explanation at all, because it still seems pretty abstract and hard to follow. So let's give an example. Hazlett gives one about baseball and pitching. Somebody's going to pitch in the whatever Red Sox game or something. I don't sport. I'm going to use that as a verb. So the example's fine, but I'm going to give you a different one based on weather. I find it very easy to follow. So look, for a regular belief about the world, it will rain tomorrow, right? Let's say I now believe that it's going to rain tomorrow. That belief we have that it's going to rain tomorrow is defeated or becomes unjustified if we come to have other beliefs. We're in reason state R. We have one or more other beliefs, right, that result in us abandoning our belief that P. So look, if I believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, but then several reliable weather forecasts all tell me that it's not going to rain, right? And on the basis of those forecasts, I cease to believe that it will rain tomorrow. Then my belief that it will rain tomorrow has been defeated by those other beliefs I come to hold based on the weather forecasts. Right? So I hope that makes sense. So a defeater is really something that makes us lose justification we have for a belief. And maybe I'll stop even right here. In epistemology or the theory of knowledge, there are a lot of different things we're interested in exploring within that area. I say we, I mean philosophers generally. The nature of truth, how it is that human beliefs connect to truth, and so on. The thing that Hazlett's really most interested in here, and what I've been talking about, is really the notion of justification. So we all have beliefs. We believe all sorts of things all the time, right? We believe it's going to rain tomorrow. I believe it's hot outside right now. Right? You believe you're watching this video about me and that I'm not actually an alien disguised as a human. Right? Whatever it is. We have all sorts of beliefs. But our beliefs might be justified or not. Right? So look, here's another belief that I could hold. I don't really hold it, but I could hold the belief that today I am going to walk 5,212 steps. Right? Now, if I say I had a pedometer, right, something that counted the number of steps I took in a day, and it turned out that, on average, that's how many steps in a day I walked. If I were to hold that belief, the belief would have some kind of justification, right? I could point to some reason why I hold it. Say I walked exactly that number of steps every day for a year, just somehow, right? This seems highly unlikely, but imagine it was. Then it seems like I'd have really strong justification for holding that belief. Now, as it is, I don't wear a pedometer. I don't count the number of steps I take, right? I don't even know if that's like in the right ballpark for the number of steps a day people take, because I know people do, count steps, use pedometers and things like this. So if I were to actually believe right now that whatever number I said, 5,000 or whatever steps, let's just call it a cool 5,000, exactly 5,000 steps. If I actually believe that's how many steps I was going to walk by the time I went to bed tonight, and I had none of that evidence, I didn't wear a pedometer, I never counted my steps or anything like that, and I believe that's exactly how many steps I was going to count. Right. And my belief wasn't that I would step around or take that around that many steps, but rather that I would step exactly that many steps. I wouldn't really be justified in that belief, right? What if I believe that tomorrow's winning lottery numbers would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? I don't even know if the lottery is 7 numbers. Of course, the lottery. Which lottery? There's more than one lottery. Right, imagine that was, I believe that. Right? I firmly believe that. And I went and I spent my life savings on lottery tickets. I put down the, total bet, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And somebody said, wow, you seem really certain. You put down your whole life savings, all $12. What makes you so certain? I said, I just got a good feeling about it, right? You would probably think I was not a very wise person. And I think you'd be right. Now, of course, if I had, inside information and the lottery was rigged or something, then maybe I'd have really good reason to believe it. But if I just, I got a good feeling about it, right? Sometimes we might just hold beliefs, and we can't point to any evidence, any kind of reason why we hold belief. In that kind of situation, we lack justification. So this is really what Hazlett's interested in here. Thinking about beliefs we can have a belief that is justified somehow. A defeater is precisely the kind of thing that goes after the justification, tries to reduce or eliminate the justification. Now, when we talk about a defeater, really what we're trying to talk about is something that really gets rid of the justification. So not just weaken it, but actually get rid of it. So it defeats the justification we have. So in some sense, you can think about just what we're talking about here and think about it in relation to what are we doing in this whole course. So this first topic is actually pretty nice in terms of giving some examples of things and a little bit more information in terms of what are we doing here if you haven't done philosophy, or haven't done much philosophy before. Well, ultimately, in producing arguments and sharing them with each other, what we're trying to do is figure out why it is reasonable people, would believe things that are controversial, right? And try to provide justification, some reason or set of reasons, point to pieces of evidence for why a reasonable person should hold that belief. When we're posing objections to arguments, really what we're doing is looking for something like a defeater, right? Yeah, I see how somebody might think this piece of evidence or this kind of reason would provide a justification for that kind of belief, but here's a defeater or some other reason or piece of evidence that shows that it doesn't really do it. So that's what's going on. All right, now in addition to talking about defeaters, in around this part in the article fairly early on, Hazlett also talks about internalism and externalism. So, and internalists and externalists about justification. Now, basically, what's going on here, and if you've done, the third year theory of knowledge course, or you've done some other courses that familiarized you with this, that basically what the distinction is here is that internalists think that we can only be justified in believing something on the basis of other beliefs we hold. Whereas externalists think that justification can, in some sense, escape our notice, so that justification is a matter of how things really are, not merely what we believe about things. So internalists think that the only way we can be justified in believing something is based on the other beliefs we hold, Whereas an externalist is willing to say you can be justified in your belief about something based on something that goes beyond or lies outside of your own belief structure. So just thinking about our beliefs about the world around us, one externalist view is that we're justified in our beliefs about the external world if they track truth, right? If they accurately reflect the way things really are, even if we aren't sure or necessarily believe that our beliefs are like that. Another view is that there are sort of appropriate causal mechanisms that produce beliefs that accurately reflect the way things are. And so if our beliefs are the result of those causal processes, whether or not we know that they are, then we're justified in holding the beliefs that we do. Now, Hazlett doesn't make heavy weather out of this discussion or this distinction between internalism and externalism. In fact, part of what he's trying to do in the paper is argue that whether or not you're an internalist or an externalist, there's a whole ongoing literature and debate between those two camps within epistemology. He says, the position I'm trying to take up in this paper doesn't depend on us assuming one of those views is right. It works either way. And so we're just going to shelf this whole discussion. So when you see that discussion of internalism, externalism, don't worry too much about it. I've just given you some sense of what's going on there, but it's not really crucial for understanding the arguments Hazlett's trying to make. All right, so we've got the idea of a defeater here. Now, what about hinge beliefs and basic beliefs, right? So there's hinge propositions, and Hazlett says, I'm going to introduce the notion of hinge beliefs, which is very much like hinge propositions, just a little bit different. So basic beliefs are beliefs that are not justified in virtue of their logical or inferential relations to any other of a subject's beliefs. Inferential is really, in terms of reasoning structure. When we look at a reason and draw a conclusion, or we look at some evidence and draw some sort of conclusion on it, we're making an inference. That's really what he's talking about. So basic beliefs are, so when we're thinking about the beliefs we hold, and then this question of justified, what justifies the sorts of beliefs we have, basic beliefs in epistemological terminology are the sorts of beliefs that don't have to be justified by the evidence we have, right? And the way Hazlett's putting it here, it's not based on logical or inferential relations to any other beliefs we have. So it's not, for a basic belief to hold it and be justified, in some sense, they stand on their own. So in holding a basic belief, you're just justified in holding it. You don't have to point to any pieces of evidence or support for it to be justified in holding a basic belief. Hinge propositions are those propositions P, again, P just stands for whatever, it will rain tomorrow, you're watching a video right now, what have you. So hinge propositions are those propositions such that belief that P is a necessary condition on rationally having a lot of knowledge. Hinge beliefs, right, which are really just beliefs in hinge propositions, are a subset of basic beliefs. So Hazlett thinks that these hinge beliefs, the ones that he's really interested in, are ones that are necessary for us to rationally have a lot of knowledge. And that's ultimately what he's trying to get at in the paper, is that we're justified in believing that the world is the way it seems to us, right? In some sense, almost automatically, because if we don't do that, we won't be able to rationally have a lot of knowledge. So our belief that the world is the way it basically seems to us, unless we have good reason to think otherwise, unless we have enough reason to defeat that belief, that belief itself is a hinge belief. We need it to have a lot of knowledge, and it's a basic belief. Namely, we don't have to have evidence or some kind of justification to actually support that belief. Rather, it stands on its own as the thing that needs to be defeated. It should automatically be accepted unless we have sufficient reason to reject it. Note that this is basically the reverse of what Descartes is trying to do with the method of systematic doubt. So what Descartes is trying to do with the method of systematic doubt is say, unless you have, basically certainty, unless it's almost 100% certain that the belief in question is true, you should regard it as false. Hazlett is basically trying to turn that burden of proof on its head and say, for hinge beliefs, the ones that are are necessary for us to rationally have a lot of knowledge. Unless you have sufficient reason, maybe not 100%, but unless you have enough reason, unless you're justified in believing that that Hinge belief is false, you're automatically justified in believing that it's true. And you don't need to be able to point to any reasons for why it's true. Rather, it's the fact that the kind of role it plays in our belief structure, that it's this necessary condition on rationally having a lot of knowledge, that makes us justified in holding it. It's not any other piece of evidence that we could point to. Rather, it's the role it plays in allowing us to have other sorts of beliefs. Now, one thing I will say, so let's sort of move on here to Reid and the arguments that Hazlett's introducing. So he talks about Thomas Reid's response to skepticism. Thomas Reid was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, most famous for responding to David Hume and defending sort of a common sense viewpoint. Now, David Hume another 18th century Scottish philosopher, comes in the early modern tradition after Descartes. So after Descartes, there are a number of other big influential thinkers, one of which is Hume, who, in looking back on the philosophizing and the thinking that's been going on, ultimately puts forward a fairly skeptical view. So Descartes is trying to get us down to the foundations and say, okay, let's try to build back up on what seems certain or almost indubitable. And effectively what happens is that through interesting development in philosophy, by the time Hume comes around and surveys the scene, he ultimately defends a fairly skeptical position, saying, well, you can't really be too certain about anything. You really can't be certain that the external world is the way you think it is. Descartes ultimately argues that we can. Why? Because God's really nice, and it would be really, really mean of God to trick us by plugging us into something like the Matrix or something like that. So the world must be the way it seems to us, at least during the times that we're virtually certain of what we're observing. And Hume sort of comes along and says, that really seems to be putting the cart before the horse, right? Appealing to our belief in God and God's properties as a way to justify my belief that there are actually books over on that shelf when I'm sitting here talking to you right now. Right? Hume says that's really sort of flipping things on its head. As an upshot, Hume thinks we can't really fully justify, we can't make certain that the world is the way it seems to us. And so ultimately Hume's response, well, so what should we do? Go play pool and drink some beer with your friends. That's about as good as it's going to get. So just be happy with that, right? We should really try to give up on some of these questions and some of these projects rather than trying to really answer them. Now, Reid did not like that. Reid was not happy with that kind of skeptical approach. And so Reid responds to the skeptic, really sort of Hume, but Hume is just a skeptic, at least of a sort, when there are many others, right? So Reid responds that it's impossible to give up our belief on the external world, that the world is really the way it seems to us most of the time. Now, Hazlett points out some confusion here. He says, in a weak sense, anything counterfactual seems impossible to believe. Given what we currently believe, we couldn't be believing in something else, right? Based on our available evidence and available reasons. Of course, we believe what we do. We can't just change our mind. I can't just, just instantly change my mind about something, right? Right now, I don't believe it's going to rain tomorrow. I believe there's some chance it's going to rain tomorrow, based on the weather forecast I recently looked at. I can't now, without any additional evidence, just change my mind about that and say, no, it definitely isn't going to rain, right? Even better, I'll say there's sort of a low percent chance it's going to rain tomorrow, right? There's a slight chance. I can't just sort of turn around and say it's going to be a torrential downpour tomorrow. It's 95% likely. I just can't change my beliefs like that, right? I just can't, just like I believe I'm sitting here talking to you in this video right now, I can't just believe otherwise, just like that. So Hazlett says, of course, that's fine. But really what Reid must mean is that it's impossible for anybody to give up belief in the external world being the way it is, even if they're presented with other pieces of evidence or something like that, right? And so Hazlett says Reid's view really isn't that convincing. It is possible to give up that kind of belief if we have the right kind of justification, right? Of course, it's probably impossible to give up our belief that the external world, the world around us, is the way that it seems to be. without good evidence, without good reason to do so, without the right kind of justification. But Hazlett says, unlike Reid, there are scenarios that we're familiar with, for instance, from science fiction, right? Matrix and Exception are two examples of this. That actually give us, right, if we're in that kind of situation, we would probably have the right kind of justification to give up belief that the external world is the way it seems to us. Right? There are other experiences as well. He points to hallucinogenic drugs, right? Imagine, you were observing the world, right? Whatever it is, there's, you're just hanging out, things are fine. There's books on the shelf, you're watching the video, and there's that giant pink elephant in the room. And you sort of stop and you think about it and you say, wait a minute. Oh, right, I remember I dropped a whole bunch of acid like an hour ago. That would explain the pink elephant, because that did seem a little bit weird, right? It seemed like it didn't fit in. Hazlett points to examples such as, these are his words, a mysterious figure who knows way too much about us. We seem to leap from place to place. Reality seems to melt away. We stare into an abyss of computer symbols, pixelated images. Right? So one other example to add in there, thinking about Inception, right? A totem behaves irregularly. So we can think about Cobb's spinning top, well, really originally Mal's spinning top. If it just spins forever, well, that seems to be a giveaway, right? That would give us some kind of justification that in fact we're in a dream, even if we didn't think we were before resorting to the token, right? Or the loaded die, or the chess piece and how it's supposed to fall over. Whatever that totem is, depending on how it operates, however it functions, that might be the kind of thing, right? Or encountering the agents or Morpheus or whatever might be the kind of thing that gives us the justification we need to give up our belief that the external world is the way it seems to us. So Hazlett thinks we can do this. This is really what he's talking about in talking about Reid and that response to skepticism. So this is where we get, I'm not quite sure why the slide number is suddenly moving around on me, but oh well. The argument from norms. So there's a couple of different arguments. So the argument from norms, the argument from confusion that we're going to take a look at here. Hazlett thinks it's this argument that justifies our belief in the external world. What is it? Well, the argument from norms holds that our epistemic norms demand that we believe that there is an external world unless we have sufficient reason to believe that there isn't an external world. That is like the way we usually perceive it to be, right? Now, Hazlett really codifies this point as plus. I'm just going to admit it. I like Hazlett's paper quite a lot overall. There are two sort of stylistic points I don't like about it, which really has to do with how he codifies a couple of things. So he codifies this as plus, and then later there's sort of like a pound, number sign. I don't like that. I like it when we use words for this kind of thing. I'm going to stick with what he did just to prevent confusion, but I don't like the plus. Right? Now, one more note, right? When you're writing an essay or something like that for the course, even if you don't like this kind of thing, right, don't mention it. Now I'm mentioning to you and you're saying, oh, double standard. Well, maybe, right? Sorry. But, just stick that in a paper. I don't like this, right? If that's all it is, and that's really all I'm sharing, I don't like this little bit, just how he does this. It's probably not relevant to establishing your conclusion. And so always keep that in mind. When you're thinking about what should I put in the essay, what's really relevant to trying to actually support your conclusion, to justify a reasonable reader to believe what you believe, right? To believe what you want them to believe, because you don't have to necessarily believe or endorse the arguments you're putting forward. They just have to be good arguments. Okay, so this point, plus, right, the way he tries to codify it, he puts it this way. He says, justified belief in the external world is defeated only by sufficient reason to believe that there is not an external world. Here again, I wish he used slightly different language. Again, keep in mind when he's saying, believe that there is not an external world, that's like the way we think the world really is. So it's not just that there is no external world, but rather that the external world is not the way we typically take it to be. So you can think about Neo's situation, say in the Matrix, right? That's a very good example of that. You can also think about the example of characters in Inception, right? Ariadne, when she doesn't realize she's in a dream. Other characters as well, when they don't realize that they're in a dream, right? That they think they're in the world the way it really is, when in fact they are not. Okay, now Hazlett holds that in practice we abide by plus, right? That really this is how we operate anyway. He's just trying to articulate something that we already live by. And so what he wants to do is to actually figure out what supports plus, what if anything. And that is what we come around to next, which is the argument from confusion. So Hazlett looks at three different scenarios: lovers, losers, and liars. Now, I'll sort of explain the three scenarios here just verbally, but in each case, there's a 50-50 chance that something is true, right? Now, the point that he really wants to make, so I'll talk about the situations in a second. The justification for believing that whatever it is true is non-epistemic. There's a non-epistemic source. At least in the liar's case, there's an epistemic justification going on as well. So there are different kinds of justification, right? There are epistemic justifications are ones that have to do with our knowledge. If we're epistemically justified in holding a belief or whatever it is, that's because it has something to do with our ability to know things, attain the truth, and so on. There are other kinds of justification: moral justification, right, or ethical justification, might be legal justification, might be aesthetic justification, right? Somebody who's justified in making a certain choice of costume or lighting or shooting, right, if we're thinking about, say, films, based on aesthetic considerations, right? Not necessarily moral or legal or epistemic considerations, but just aesthetic or artistic considerations, right? And don't take this list as exhaustive either. Just these are things that come to mind, right? What gives you the right to do that? What entitles you to do that, right? Legal rights, moral rights, aesthetic considerations, trying to maximize aesthetic value, whatever exactly that means, right? Make things more beautiful and so on. Epistemic justifications. Okay, so in lovers, so let's get around to these three scenarios. In lovers, he says there's a 50% chance that romantic partners cheat regularly. He's not claiming this is true, right? Again, you've got to keep in mind that when we're doing philosophy and we're trying to be philosophical, not everything that's being sort of asserted or seemingly asserted is being asserted as actually being true. Rather, there's often a lot of hypothetical reasoning going on. That's exactly what he's doing here. He's proposing these as thought experiments of this, right? He says, imagine a situation where it was true, that there's a 50% chance that romantic partners cheat regularly, or 50% of them do it. So to believe that your own romantic partner doesn't cheat regularly, he says that might be justified really on grounds that a lack of trust is not conducive to love, right? So if you know that 50% of romantic partners cheat regularly, it's just sort of a coin toss, right? 1 in every 2 do it. What reason do you have to believe that your romantic partner isn't cheating on you regularly, right? Well, if you have no really good evidence one way or the other, it's really a coin toss. It's just 50-50, yes or no, right? So you're not epistemically justified in believing that they aren't cheating on you. But you still could be justified in believing that they're not, based on the fact that a loving relationship requires some kind of trust near the foundation. Right? So you could be justified in the pursuit of love, in maintaining a loving relationship, in trusting your romantic partner, even if it turns out you're wrong. You just think about the reverse of that, right? Imagine trying to get your romantic partner to convince you that they're not cheating on you constantly. Right? I can't think of a better way. Well, okay, I could probably actually think of a better way, but that seems like a really good way to just utterly torpedo a romantic relationship, right? Were you cheating on me? Prove that you weren't cheating on me. What do you want me to do? Tape record. Nobody's going to tape record anymore, but record myself 24/7 to show you, so you can go over the logs and see that I'm not cheating. All right, the second case, the case of losers, is similar to the case of lovers, except it's a 50-50 chance that if I compete against Chris the pool shark, that I'll lose in playing against him, right? Hazlett says here, you're not epistemically justified in believing that you're going to win if you play against them, but you could be justified in believing that you're going to win precisely because believing that you're going to win might be a necessary condition of actually winning. But if you go into it believing that you're going to lose or believing that there's only a 50-50 chance you're going to win, that itself might be enough to make you lose. So you can be justified in terms of the chances of winning in believing that you're going to win, rather than any kind of epistemic reason, any piece of good evidence. Right, you can think about this for other sorts of competitions as well, right? If somebody goes to the Olympics or whatever it is, right, they're competing in some kind of high-stakes scenario. If they don't believe that they're going to win, or at least believe that there's a really good chance in some sense that they're going to win, they're probably not going to, right? If they go into it, they're like, well, I'm probably going to screw this up, and it's not going to go anywhere. That itself could contribute to them not doing well. Okay, now in liars, this is where things get a little bit different, even though the scenario's somewhat similar. So in liars, the scenario is that 50% of people are just terrible liars, that they just lie all the time. But Hazlett says we'd still be justified in believing the testimony of others. We'd still be justified in believing what other people tell us. Why? Well, we'd still be justified in believing what other people tell us, right? At least until we have reason to not believe what they've told us. Because believing what other people say is a necessary condition for successful social interaction, which itself is a good. So that's a non-epistemic reason, right? But we're also justified on epistemic grounds. We have an epistemic justification. Namely, that without believing what other people tell us, we would be unable to have a lot of beliefs, right? And having a lot of beliefs is a precondition for having a lot of knowledge, and having a lot of knowledge is an epistemic good. So even though we can never, in the liars scenario, where 50% of people just lie all the time, we can't know up front when people are telling us something, whether or not they're telling us the truth. If we just stopped believing what people told us because it was 50-50 that it was going to be a lie anyways, Hazlett says we would have to give up an awful lot of our beliefs, right? Think for a moment about how many of your beliefs are actually based on the testimony of other people, what other people have told you. For instance, look, I've never been to China or India. I have friends who have lived there, right? I know they exist on maps. I hear about them in news and everything, but I've never seen them. I've never been there myself. So really all of my knowledge about China and India comes from the testimony of others, understood broadly to be what other people say about things. Right? If I didn't believe what other people told me, if I didn't believe the testimony of others, I wouldn't have reason to believe that those places are real. Right? In fact, I wouldn't have good reason to believe that the globe, well, necessarily that the Earth is round, that the various countries that I now believe, I think justifiably exist in the world, are actually there. Right? For all I know, it's if you drive far enough south, right? I've never been south of the equator. For all I know, it's a bunch of like dwarves and mythical creatures that live down there, right? There's like dragons and I don't know, whatever. I don't believe that. Why? Because I believe what other people tell me. So Hazlett says in the liar's case, we have a non-epistemic justification, believing what other people tell us, right? Successful social interaction depends on being trusting, at least to some degree, of what other people say. But we also have an epistemic justification that even if half of people were terrible liars, if we just didn't believe what people told us until we had independent reason to believe what they were telling us, then we would actually lose a lot of our beliefs, and that would really preclude or limit our ability to have a lot of knowledge. Because having a lot of knowledge is an epistemic good. Right? And saying it's an epistemic good, it's really a good related to knowledge, which seems obvious if you put it that way. Hazlett says then it constitutes an epistemic justification. All right. So with that in our pocket, right? So this is really the argument from confusion. What does that really add up to? Look, if we gave up on plus, or if we gave up on this sort of approach to things, we would ultimately lose a lot of our beliefs. We'd lose a lot of knowledge. Really, our cognitive architecture would be thrown into confusion. Right? What we claim to know and the structure of what we know, what we take to be evidence, and how it supports other things would really be completely upended, and we would be, in a sense, disoriented. Confused is really how it's talking about. One other brief note just on the fact that Hazlett saying that it's an epistemic justification that we get in the liar's case. He deals with the potential objection that the justification would be pragmatic but not epistemic. Pragmatic just in the sense that it provides a kind of practical good. Right? So there are some debates within philosophy and particularly epistemology about the differences between what constitutes an epistemic justification, so what justifies us in terms of the kind of knowledge we get versus merely pragmatic justification. It sort of works well enough to get us by, whether or not it's really conducive to getting the truth or having fully justified beliefs or something. Now, Hazlett rejects that. He says, no, I don't think it's merely pragmatic good. It really is an epistemic justification we get, even if some of the beliefs that we form on the basis of the scenario, right, turn out to be false. So even if we go around believing people in a liar scenario, we're going to have some false beliefs as a result of that. But just because a certain approach to gaining new beliefs leads to false beliefs, even if some of them are false beliefs, it's still necessary to have that kind of approach to be able to get a lot of knowledge, because you needed to get a lot of beliefs to get a lot of knowledge. And so there is an epistemic justification going on. All right. Now, Hazlett thinks we are epistemically justified in believing in the external world, as long as that belief is not defeated by evidence. Right? Why? Very similar to the liar situation. If we don't believe in the external world, we don't believe that it's out there and it's largely the way it seems to us, then we're going to have very few beliefs, which means that we're going to have very little knowledge. Right? Think about that. If you actually convinced yourself to not believe that the world, or to believe that the world was not really like it seems to be most of the time, right? You convinced yourself to believe that you're really in a computer simulation, or you're really in the Matrix, or you're really stuck in a dream, like Inception might be telling us, but of course, maybe not. Right? Well, then you're going to have to come to reject an awful lot of your beliefs, really, all or almost all of your beliefs based on your sensory experience. And if you really sit and think about it, what kinds of beliefs are you going to have if you've rejected all the beliefs based on your sensory experience? Well, you're going to be in something like Descartes' position, right? You could be pretty certain, I think, maybe not positive, that you are a thinking thing, right? Or maybe you can be positive. Right? I don't want to bias you on that point, but I'm just saying you could object to it. People have. So you might be certain that you're a thinking thing, and that you can doubt and believe and so on. But what else? Not much. Not much of interest, I don't think. Right? We tend not to go around saying, I'm a thinking thing. Oh, that's very interesting. What else do you know? No, nothing. Right? Nothing at all. We think there's a lot of other knowledge that's important and worth having that goes beyond that. But if we reject our belief in the external world, we're going to have to reject our beliefs in almost everything, which means we're going to have very little knowledge indeed. So our belief in the external world is a hinge proposition. Really, I should have put that it's a hinge belief, right? That the external world is largely the way it appears to us would be the hinge proposition. So Hazlett says we're epistemically justified in believing that the external world is largely the way it is, unless that belief is defeated. Unless we have good enough reason to not believe it, we're justified, automatically almost, in believing that it is the way it is, at least largely speaking, right? Because if we didn't hold that belief, then we wouldn't be able to have a lot of knowledge. Which is why it's an epistemic justification. It's not sort of merely pragmatic, or it's not just like, well, look, you got to get by in the world, so just believe this, right? Whether or not it's true. Hazlett saying, look, it's really an epistemic justification. You get an epistemic good out of believing the world is the way it is, right? That you can get a lot of knowledge, at least potentially. If you don't believe the world is the way it is, you're going to be almost certainly just cut off from it. All right. So, there's another sort of complication in Hazlett's piece about how all this comes together. So we got plus, right, which is supported by the argument from confusion. And this generalizes into support for security. And security contradicts underdetermination principles, at least for beliefs. So what are these? So security is this, right? This is how he puts it. So S's justified hinge belief that P is defeated only if S has sufficient reason to believe not P. That's the sort of squiggly P means not P. So what does that mean? So S, again, just any subject, you or me or, Neil or Cobb or Ariadne or Mal or Morpheus or Trinity or whomever, right? Our justified hinge belief, and again, a hinge belief is a kind of basic belief, so one that we don't even, you don't require evidence or reasons to really to be able to point to for them. Certainly not specific ones. So what Hazlett has been trying to do here is say, look, that we do have an epistemic justification for a belief that the external world is the way it is. That belief is a hinge belief of sorts. We do have a justification for that belief, namely that without that belief we can't have a lot of knowledge, but we don't need specific evidence that the world really is the way it is, right? The fact that we need to believe that to be able to have a lot of knowledge, that itself is the justification. Right? We don't need anything more. We don't need anything specific that tells me, I really am not in a dream, or I'm really not plugged into the matrix. Right? We don't have to be able to do that kind of specific work. So our justified hinge belief that P, say that the external world is the way it seems to be, is defeated only if S, whoever it is, me, you, one of the characters, has sufficient reason to believe not P. So if the belief in question is that the world is really the way it seems to be, we're only defeated in that belief, we only lose our justification in that belief, if we have sufficient reason, that is enough reason, enough justification to believe the opposite, right? That, in fact, that belief's false. So it's only when, right, and if Neo comes to have sufficient reason to believe that the world is not the way it normally appears to him, that he's, right, ends up losing his justification that the world's the way it does seem to be most of the time. Right? Similarly, it's only, think about, say, inception, it's only once somebody comes to have sufficient reason to believe that, say, they are in a dream, that they lose their justification for believing that they're not in a dream. So our default status is being justified in believing the world is really the way it seems to be to us. And it's only when we have sufficient reason to believe that's false, right? Because we have sufficient reason to justify our belief that, in fact, that an alternative, right, a contrary alternative is true, that we lose that justification. So that's security. Now, UP, this is really the underdetermination principles. This one might be the most complicated of all. And in fact, Hazlett here mentions Adam Elga and Nick Bostrom, and in fact cites the Bostrom paper we were just talking about yesterday. And he sort of finger wags and he says the kind of underdetermination principles that people like Bostrom endorse, and we heard about this yesterday, are really indifference principle. That's, Bostrom was sort of talking about that. Hazlett says those lead to some funny conclusions, right? I've got concerns about those. So there's there's one more sort of interesting thing. And when you're thinking about sort of what goes on in philosophy, we've got all these different concepts, all these different sort of interesting ideas sort of floating around in the air. What should we believe? Why should we believe it? How do we formulate different principles like this? Which one should we use, right, in our thinking about things? How should we evaluate evidence? This is part of what philosophy is doing at a highly abstract, general, theoretical level. Does that mean philosophy is somehow better than, say, particular other disciplines, particular sciences or something that are employing this concept? No, it's just doing a different kind of work, right? So in one area of philosophy is philosophy of science, right, where concepts frequently employed in the sciences are really taken and sort of analyzed and evaluated, right? What do they really mean? If we have different alternatives for those concepts, which one should we employ? Why should we employ them? And really, the line between doing science and doing philosophy of science is in some ways kind of thin, right? A working scientist, somebody who calls himself a scientist, will engage in this kind of philosophizing. Somebody who calls himself a philosopher might be engaged in doing science of particular sorts. So it's, in some ways, we try to draw those boundaries and say, no, this is science and that's philosophy. I think at extremes that makes sense, but once we start getting closer to the middle, things get blurred. Just like I was talking about what philosophy is, philosophy and religion are different things, at their extremes in particular, but as you start getting closer to their middle ground, the lines start to blur. Right? Is this philosophy? Is it religion? What do you mean? Right? What are those things? As soon as I do that, I think we're back doing philosophy. Okay, so coming back to the underdetermination principles here, at least for hinge beliefs, this is what Hazlett's really interested in. So we've got this. And again, you've got to think in terms of these are variables or placeholders of the sort. So if H1 and H2 are hypotheses, so hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, whatever it might be, right? Hypothesis 1 could be the external world's the way it seems to be. Hypothesis 2, the external world is not the way it seems to be to me. Right? Hypothesis 1, I am plugged into the matrix. Hypothesis 2, I'm not plugged into the matrix. Right? Hypothesis 1, I'm in a dream. Hypothesis 2, I'm not in a dream. So if H1 and H2 are hypotheses, and E is all of S's evidence, right? So E for evidence, S is justified in believing hypothesis 1 only if, we get some formulation here. P H1 sort of over E is greater than P H2 over E. Really, what's that meaning? That our evidence for hypothesis 1 is greater than our evidence for hypothesis 2. That if we're only justified in believing hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 2 if the evidence is stronger for one of them than the other. That's really what this means. Right? So if your evidence is equal either way, then you're really not justified in believing either. Right? Think about the Bostrom piece. Bostrom says at least one of these three propositions are true, but I don't really have I can't consider the evidence and really weigh it up in a sensible way, in part because we just don't know what post-human civilizations are going to be like. We also don't really know the probability of civilizations reaching the post-human stage. So our underdetermination principle, the fact that we don't really have evidence to tell us one of those propositions is more likely to be true than any other, what should we do? Equally apportion our belief to the three, right? So we should believe equally as much that we are currently in a simulation, that we should believe that our species will not reach the post-human stage, and we should believe that as equally as much as the view that post-human civilizations just wouldn't be interested in running ancestor simulations. Right? That's it. Right? Hazlett doesn't endorse that, at least for Hinge beliefs. Right? He also mentions indifference principles being used by Elga and Bostrom, which are quite similar to underdetermination principles, right? Again, think about the indifference principles, or the bland indifference principle Bostrom was invoking. Unless we've got good reason to believe so, we shouldn't regard ourselves or our species as special or somehow lying outside of the probabilities. And then, right, so that's one way of approaching, that's one kind of principle or a couple of principles to be invoking and using when we're doing epistemology. And like I already mentioned, we can think about Descartes' skepticism as employing different sorts of epistemic principles, right? His method of doubt, of systematic doubt, is one that employs this principle that says, unless you're virtually certain that a belief is true, right? Unless you can't even doubt it, then you should regard it as false. That's a really, really strong principle, and it's not one we use walking around day to day, right? If I don't know, make myself a sandwich, I assume it's not going to kill me or otherwise, seriously hurt me because, the sandwiches I've eaten in the past have never done so. Can I be absolutely certain? No, right? I don't know if it's got something bad in it or it's laced with poison or something. I'm not certain, right? But I believe strongly enough, often based on no real evidence, other than the fact that I have no evidence that it is poisoned or otherwise, going to seriously hurt me, that it's going to be fine. Okay, so just sort of coming back to this, so we've got security here. Hazlett thinks security is ultimately supported by plus is supported by from confusion, right? So ultimately Hazlett thinks we're justified in believing in security, right? At least for Hinge beliefs. And we're not justified, we shouldn't believe the underdetermination principle that he's got here at the bottom, that really to believe one hypothesis over an alternative, we need to have stronger evidence for that hypothesis than the alternative, at least not for Hinge beliefs, right? What does that mean? When we're faced with, the general belief, the external world exists in as much the way it seems like it is to me, right? Versus it's contrary, right? Or negation, right? But the external world isn't really the way it seems to me. Hazlett doesn't think we should approach that using underdetermination principles. We shouldn't say, well, you're only justified in believing the world's really the way it is if you've got more evidence for that than the alternative. All right? Instead, he thinks security is really the right way to go, which is that we should feel, he doesn't quite put it this way, but we should feel secure in our belief that the external world is the way it is, unless we've got sufficient reason to believe that it's not. Right? So just by default, we're justified in believing the world is the way it is. Why? Because we need to, as a necessary condition for having a lot of knowledge, and that's an epistemic good. Hence, it's an epistemic justification. So now we come around to the three proposals for anti-skeptical positions. So he formulates these pretty precisely. It's sort of nicely done, so I'll just sort of put those back up here and just elaborate a little bit. So first, our justification for hinge beliefs is defeatable. So Hazlett thinks we are justified in our hinge belief that the external world exists and is the way it seems to us, but those beliefs are defeatable, right? And he points back to the science fiction examples, which, thinly veiled reference to the Matrix, and of course I think we could add Inception in there, being under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs and so on. We can have sufficient reason to abandon a hinge belief, but we rarely, if ever, actually have such a sufficient reason. Or if you actually were in Neo's situation, or Ariadne's, or Cobb's, or Mal's situation, right? You might have sufficient reason to give up your belief in the external world. But the mere fact that those are possible, right, that those situations could happen, is not enough to justify you in giving up that belief, right? That doesn't defeat that belief. We shouldn't be approaching things the way Descartes does. And one here goes against somebody like Reid. 2, our theory of justification must uniformly account for our justification in the face of actual world skepticism as well as other skepticisms. So there are various sorts of skeptical scenarios, dreaming scenarios, evil demon scenarios, brain and vat scenarios, living in computer simulation scenarios, so on and so on. Given that there are some actual world situations where the threat of skepticism is real, right, whether in any particular instance we're actually dreaming or actually awake, right, or if it's even our whole life that we're dreaming, we should have a theory that can uniformly treat the various sorts of skeptical threats that we might encounter. Hazlett thinks. This is really a kind of, epistemology, future work should be looking for this uniform theory of justification that can confront skepticism this way. Thirdly and lastly, any plausible theory of knowledge and justification must hold that hinge beliefs are basic beliefs, i.e. id est Latin for that is, that their justification is non-inferential. So just one note on that, when you see i.e. like this, really what he's saying is that, the theory of knowledge and justification must hold that hinge beliefs are basic beliefs, or in other words, that their justification, the justification of hinge beliefs, is non-inferential. Because hinge beliefs are basic beliefs, they have a kind of default status. They're justified by default. We don't need evidence that such a belief is true to be justified when believing it. So when faced with a skeptical threat, security means that we don't need to defend our hinge beliefs and hold them with certainty. Rather, it's up to the skeptical threat to show that our hinge beliefs are false by presenting sufficient evidence to support the claim that, in fact, they are false. So that brings us to the end of the Hazlett piece. I hope you can now see what I was saying at the start, that it is a little bit complicated. There's some technical terminology going on there. Maybe some references to people that you don't know, but don't let that get in your way, right? Just if he's talking about somebody and you say, I don't know who that is, just assume it's a well-known philosopher. You'll be in pretty safe territory. So really what Hazlett does here is give us a case for why we are justified in believing the external world is the way it seems to us, even when we are aware of scenarios like the Matrix and Inception, where there are situations presented to us where in fact we those characters might get, and I'm going to leave it to you to think about and to argue about whether or not they really do get sufficient reason to believe the world isn't the way they think it is at any particular time, right? Again, you've got to think it in particular, right? Just don't think, the whole movie or the whole thing, right? Think about particular characters at particular points in the films. What kind of evidence do they have available to them? How do they judge it? What are they thinking? Are they justified in making the assertions they do and holding beliefs that they do, right? And there's, and even in thinking about that, why are they justified or not in believing something or other based on the evidence they have? given their situation. Engaging in exactly this kind of reasoning is largely what epistemology is interested in, often again on a very high level of abstraction or generality. So you can consider part of what I'm asking you to do here in thinking about these films and the situations that the characters find themselves in, as well as the situation you find yourself in, given the fact that you know about what's going on in these films now, as a kind of applied epistemology. In these particular sorts of cases, who's justified in believing what and when are they justified in doing so? Hazlett should give you a few additions to your intellectual toolkit to try to engage with some of those problems. Go ahead and wrap this video up now. So this is the end of our course content for this week, the end of this first unit that we're looking at. And I'll be back next week on Monday in another video talking about how the next topic of value and reality, really the question is, does something have to be real to be valuable? How that comes up in Inception, The Matrix, and the next film we're going to include in the course, Ready Player One. Have an excellent rest of your week and an excellent weekend, and you'll see me next week when I talk about our next topic. Until then, stay well and bye for now.